My name is Sherman. I've been working on an idea called evidence-based policing for over 20 years now. And before that, with the New York City Police Department, Metropolitan Police in London, at Scotland Yard, and many other places, to try to find the most effective ways police can identify the greatest risks to public safety and the most effective ways of reducing those risks. The way I have approached this is through experiments as well as big data and increasingly what's called digital policing. The problem of knife crime and murders committed with knives is a good example of how evidence-based policing can improve police effectiveness. The biggest problem in preventing crime is to predict where and when it's going to occur. And while there's many places in London, for example, in the 4,800 local areas where a murder might occur, you still don't know when it's going to happen. It could be one of 2.5 billion opportunities in different places in different minutes of the year. But you can still do better than just say fatalistically, if it's going to happen, it's going to happen. In fact, Detective Chief Inspector John Massey of the Metropolitan Police, working in the homicide squad, doing his master's thesis at Cambridge University, decided to try to predict where, if not when, the next knife murder is going to occur. And what he found with almost 100 knife murders in London in 2018 was that not one local area had more than one knife murder. So he couldn't identify hotspots of repeat knife murders. They don't exist, at least not in London, and as far as I know, in most places. But what he could do was to show that the more stabbings that are not fatal that may occur in a location, the more likely it is that a fatal stabbing is going to occur. And we were able to look across all 4,800 local areas of London and see that 60% of them roughly had never had a stabbing in the prior year, and they only had a 1% risk of having a knife murder in the next year. Another group of about 1,200 had had at least one stabbing, and that, only one stabbing led to a doubling of the risk of homicide. And the more prior stabbings they had, you go up the level of risk to the point where once you've had 7 or more stabbings in one local area in the prior year, the chance of a homicide happening is 15%. Now that has huge implications not only for where you might assign police to do patrols or stop and search, but it also has implications for whether you would invoke the legal powers of Section 60 of a criminal law that empowers the police to use stop and search with a lower evidentiary standard for deciding who they might check to see if they have a knife. If they can do that, they might discourage knife carrying, and if people aren't carrying knives, they can't stab somebody else to death with them. But part of the problem with understanding this is to see that it takes systematic analysis of a long period of time, not just last week, which is when most intelligence-led hotspots policing of knife crime happens. We want to know what's happening lately. That doesn't predict as well as looking at an entire year. And in any case, people haven't tested the short-term predictions very rigorously, so if you're in a place like the Royal Society, which has a motto in Latin that basically says, what's the evidence? The evidence might be qualitative, that there's some gang conflict going on, so there might be a stabbing tonight. And that could be good, but I've never seen it tested against 4,800 areas and 3,500 stabbings over 1 year. If you distribute those stabbings across those areas, you see huge differences in, like, volcanoes coming up out of a flat prairie. That volcano of high level risk of homicide is the place where you could focus policing with much greater effectiveness in preventing homicides than if you just spread policing evenly out over all of London, most of which has never had a knife homicide and will never have a knife homicide. It's like giving a lot of pills to people who aren't sick. And what we do with evidence-based policing, as in evidence-based medicine, is to try to concentrate the treatment where it's going to do the most good. The question of how research gets applied in police practice is very important. 40 years ago, it was a matter of a university does a study, the study might get in the newspaper. I did one on domestic violence that showed that arrest was more effective than warnings for reducing repeat minor domestic offending over the next 6 months. That was in 500 papers around the world. As a result of that, in the early 1980s, Britain adopted a mandatory arrest policy, not until the 90s, in fact. And then they held on to it, despite the fact that subsequent research showed that the effect of arrest on unemployed people was actually negative. It was causing more violence against victims. And most recently, we found in a 23-year follow-up to a very well-controlled experiment in Wisconsin that women were more likely to die if their partners had been arrested than if they had been warned. Not through homicide, but through all causes of death. A lot of things cause death, cancer, heart attacks. All of those things were higher where there had been a disruption in this relationship by somebody's partner being arrested as opposed to being given a warning. That's inconvenient evidence, inconvenient facts. The problem that people have when they hear facts they don't like is they tend to say, I don't believe it. So it's very hard to apply research in a direct way to policies, especially if they're mandated by the parliament or the state legislature in Wisconsin, which still requires the police to make arrests, despite all of these good research findings that show that people are harmed by having arrests where people are getting slapped. An arrest is too strong for those relationships, for those fragile neighborhoods. It actually works with employed people who are in economically prosperous areas, but it's very damaging in poverty areas. And to understand that things work differently in different communities is part of community policing. So how do we put research into practice when we have a political environment that says one size must fit all, even if it hurts some people, even if the people it hurts are predominantly poor or black? These are the difficulties at that higher level. What we're moving now to is something different. In the area of digital policing, where we can change the subject from my study disagrees with your study and what are we going to do, that can be done backstage. It can become part of the operational framework of a police agency to ask certain questions when people call on the phone, as the Lancashire police are now doing. And depending on the answers to the questions, the data matching up tens of thousands of cases will help to inform a decision about whether it's necessary to send a police car, whether it's necessary to do a further investigation of a non-domestic assault. These are all things that are moving forward today in what I think is the world capital of evidence-based policing, which is England and Wales. Policing is much more about values as expressed through politics and about laws that are expressed through politics in democracies than historically they have been about patterned evidence or evidence that is derived from statistical associations with police doing things that are going to increase or reduce harm in communities. So the question of how evidence-based policing fits into values-based policing or policing under a rule of law is very important. Many people would say the evidence should never take primacy, and I would agree. But I would also say that there are many statements that are asserted because people feel like it ought to be the right fact. And that's not to say that we disapprove of the death penalty. We have people in the United States who say, I feel that the death penalty will deter murder and will make a safer society. And so because I feel that way, I want to make sure we execute people in the state of Texas, which is how it works in the state of Texas. An evidence-based approach would take the National Academy of Science report that says there's no evidence that the death penalty has a deterrent effect on murder. And based on that report, the state of Connecticut changed their laws. So fitting evidence into politics is a challenge, but it's also possible. And the role that evidence can play in an enlightened society, in a society that cares about jet planes crashing after takeoff because of the way the algorithms may have been misprogrammed into the sensors that are reading the wind and the liftoff and weight of the plane and other factors, it means that it's a complex world. And the world that we live in is so complex because it produces benefits. And we've spent at least 200 years since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution with increased precision in engineering that has been based on statistical evidence. We wouldn't be sitting in a room with electric lighting in it if that hadn't been the case. So to argue against statistical evidence as a way to improve policing is kind of like arguing against the modern world and asking us whether we'd like to go back to medieval times where the death rate was massive, where life expectancy was 25 years old. I don't think so. I think what we have to do is to have a more informed conversation about everything from climate change to public health, about what really is harming people, such as the relationship between cigarette smoking and automobile pollution. And the World Health Organization now estimates that the automobile pollution may be killing more people than cigarette smoking. And we've been far more forthright in banning public smoking than we have in banning traffic from schools where children are growing up breathing diesel fumes, including my grandson here in London, for example. So I do think that we've got to face the facts along with our values and to agree that there are facts that can be established by the methods that universities in this country and abroad have been developing for many years. It's not supposed to be easy. It's not supposed to be a comfortable solution. It's not like saying, oh, now I can join up to Facebook and put up pictures that my family can see. It turns out that even when you do that, there are lots of complicated issues raised about the power of a monopoly like Facebook. Evidence-based policing is nowhere near a monopoly. I think we're still in a very early stage of trying to get people to think differently about something that seems quite intuitive, that if the police just go out and arrest people and put them in prison, we'll have less crime. And that's what some of the newspapers in Britain will tell you every day of the week in their editorials. The facts bear out a different story. And since criminology was established at the first university in Britain in 1959, we're now on the 60th anniversary of having the science of criminology inform policy and practice in criminal justice, everything from policing to prisons and probation. And the more evidence we have, the more capacity we have to reduce crime if we can just accept that this is complicated stuff. And the days in which you can appoint a barrister like Sir Robert Peel and put him in charge of a brand new thing called a police force and to have a great result because of the simple fact of 2,000 constables patrolling the streets of London. That was a great day, and it was an early win. In a sense, it was an easy win because it was done so well by the first two commissioners of the Met, who insisted that the constables not be drunkards, that they be not corrupt, that they be fair and firm in the way they tried to prevent harm from happening in their communities. So building on that great tradition, which incidentally was inspired by one of the great criminologists of English history, Jeremy Bentham, who was a good friend of Sir Robert Peel, we just continue with the growth of knowledge in criminology in the way that it was originally applied by the creation of a police force. I think the first step for any police force that wants to institutionalize evidence-based practice is to develop a critical mass of leaders who understand the concept of evidence-based practice, who know how it's different from an intuitive or even professionally structured way of thinking about complex problems of patterns of crime rather than specific cases of proving whether somebody did or didn't commit a crime, which is the more familiar use of evidence. The term evidence in science is much broader. What is the evidence for the proposition that there's a law of gravity? Well, I can drop my keys from the floor right now and give you that evidence. But that's a universal rule of physics. If you wanted to test Darwin's theory of biological evolution and how it explains influenza epidemics, I couldn't drop a key on the floor to prove that. It's far more complicated. And most of the important things that we're doing are that much more complicated. But they require some understanding of science, of the idea of testing a hypothesis through agreed upon measures and direct observations. If you have, so number one, in a police force, if you have a critical mass of senior officers who think scientifically, as well as legally, and ethically and politically about policing problems, but to add that strong emphasis on science, that's the first step. The second step is to use that leadership to drive the integration of knowledge about the targeting of police resources, what works when you target them, and how we track what the police do. The 3 T's of targeting, testing, and tracking. If you have senior officers who are vigilant in applying the best knowledge to all of the decisions the police force makes, then you will be in a position to see what the third step is, and that is the opportunities for integrating the best knowledge in the digital machinery that makes the police department run. Everything from receiving information that a crime is in progress to seeking out information about who might be harmed in secret through unreported domestic abuse or human slavery or other kinds of unknown, undetected harm that Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary in England and Wales is pushing police agencies to at least articulate a plan for. How do you think you're going to go out and discover the unreported harm across this city? Every year we do a victimization survey, and we pick up some, certainly not all, of the crimes that are not reported to the police. We've done that for 30 or 40 years, but I've never seen a police department have a plan for how it can try to raise the percentage of all crimes that are reported in a way that's directly testable against a victimization survey. And that's something that could be part of an effort to take an evidence-based approach to measuring harm in a community that doesn't just count crimes as if they're all created equal, but actually puts the sentencing weight, the number of days of recommended imprisonment for each offense category, into the measurement of success in the police agency. And that's going back to step one. A critical mass of leaders who understand what we call the Cambridge Crime Harm Index is a very important step towards doing what the National Health Service set out to do 50 years ago, which is to have a common currency to tell the public, if you spend more money on health, these are the things that we think will result in terms of measurable reductions in loss of productive life, or years of life, as they put it with their metric called QALYs, or quality adjusted life years. We can do the same thing with the Cambridge Crime Harm Index by measuring whether the seriousness of crime reported by or about victims is going up or down, but we can't do it if we confuse it with drug arrests or other victimless crimes, even prosecuting people for carrying knives. They haven't stabbed anybody with them. It's not a victim-reported crime, but when we say knife crime's going up, we might be counting the number of arrests police are making for carrying knives, which is a good thing, which could actually reduce crime against victims. But the Office of National Statistics is a good place to start for the whole country, because until they get their statistics sorted out as to the difference between crime and policing, instead of mixing them together the way they are right now, the public is going to be misled about what is the problem and what is the solution. The single most powerful tool a police officer has to use in devoting their lives and risking their lives to protect the public, that most powerful tool is knowledge. It's not a particular technology, it's not a particular police practice. It's an understanding of how we are constantly building more and more knowledge about what works in policing, what doesn't work in policing, and how we can tell the difference based on good factual evidence that follows the rules of science. And if we can create that tool in a way that is available to every police officer, we will find police officers being more respected, being paid more, being more effective, and esteemed by the community for their ability to not just solve horrible crimes, but to keep them from happening in the first place. I'm not guaranteeing that the public will always be grateful. The public in England is largely ungrateful for having one of the lowest crime rates on earth and probably one of the best police institutions on earth. But it is not for the esteem that one does these things. It's for knowing in your heart that you're doing the best you possibly can. And that's why knowledge is such an important tool for policing.
Thank you for watching. I hope you found this content useful. You can get access to each episode's transcript with key learning points, timestamps and references if you get yourself onto my mailing list. Just go to the main EBP Dr website on ebpdoctor.com, and on the bottom of each page you will find a sign-up form for notifications of new content. Just enter your first name, your preferred email address and the type of organization you work for. You will not get any spam. This is just for me to let you know about new content and for you to get access to all the transcripts.